Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you are overwhelmed by a sense of fate. Like all the forces of nature are pulling you toward your inevitable destiny. Taking a fork in the road, you approach the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and how Orpheus possibly could have messed up his journey to the underworld so badly. At a corner table, by the fire, are three people. One of them is complaining about how he really shouldn't be eating any more Easter candy, even as he unwraps another Cadbury cream egg. And that's me, your co-host Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See. We are a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. That's all. To further this goal, we do all sorts of things. We have a regular slate of concerts, lectures, and other events, COVID permitting, of course, designed to foster love and understanding of arts and faith. And we have our own guild of artists right here in Colorado Springs, and some of us like to podcast, it turns out. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're doing stuff, why don't you rate and review our show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your 5-star reviews help us out a ton. We really appreciate those of you who take the time to do it. And we appreciate those of you who don't take the time to do it, but why don't you go ahead and do it anyway? So this show I'm really excited about, and we're recording this just a couple days after Easter. It'll probably post, a week or so from now. But Easter, let's start off with some of that talk. Our co-host today is Jane Sharl. You have heard her on the podcast previously as a guest talking about poetry, but she is now assuming the mantle of one of the co-host seats. So Jane, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm a little nervous about assuming this new mantle. We'll see how it goes.
I am confident you are ready for the responsibility. So let me ask some very serious questions first. What is your favorite Easter candy? And how much of it have you been eating?
Okay, I thought you were going to say, what is your favorite Easter poem? So now I'm totally thrown off. Probably, I don't really eat candy. Isn't that terrible? Probably just chocolate. I gave up sugar for Lent, so I've just been enjoying, a couple chocolate chips here and there, and that's enough to put my system into overdrive after no sugar.
I really envy your self-control. I am a Cadbury cream egg man. I love them.
They are
so
delicious.
Much. Even though the little metal foil always sticks to the outside and they're impossible to open, I love them so much. But my kids got some stuff, and I may have been eating some of it. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups now make something called a mallow top, where it's something with the consistency of their chocolate, but it's marshmallow flavored.
Nuh-uh.
And, the other day I took the first bite of it. It's like, oh no, I'm in trouble. They're so good, and I kind of hate myself, but that's where we are. But anyway, the topic of today's show, I am super excited about it. So a little background here. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know about our friends at Cave Pictures Publishing. They do some really great work doing graphic novels, other sorts of stuff, and we love having them on. One of their executives contacted us about this new epic poem about the Harrowing of Hell, which definitely got me intrigued, but I needed it evaluated by my poetry expert, Jane. So I sent it to her, checked in with her, was like, hey, is this good? What do you think? And your response, paraphrasing slightly, is, this is great. I love it. I can't wait to talk to the author. So here we are. And like I said, I'm very excited to talk about this. I think it's a very interesting topic. So our author, the multi-talented Jonathan Jackson. How are you doing, Jonathan?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Jonathan, I described you as multi-talented, and I very much mean it. You reading your bio, it's really impressive the different things you do. So why don't you just tell our readers, who are you and what are the many things that you do?
Sure. Well, first of all, on a personal level, I'm married. I've been married for 19 years, just about. I have 3 kids. We just moved to Ireland last year. So that's where I currently am right now in County Wexford. But my journey in the arts started when I was very young, and that probably accounts for some of the nearing artistic schizophrenia of all the different things that I've delved into. When I was 11 years old, I started working as an actor in Los Angeles on General Hospital on the soap opera, and continued to work as an actor for, since then, I guess. But over the years, acting has kind of become a bit of a day job for me, just in terms of my mentality, because I started writing songs when I was around 11 or 12 also. And then I started writing books and poetry and screenplays shortly after that. So, and it's interesting because every single one of those art forms for me, because I'm just like uneducated in pretty much everything I do, it's all through trial and error and experience. But every art form has informed the next one. So, acting and character development has informed songwriting and, and so on.
Awesome. So, and that leads us to our current topic here, which is an epic poem you have written, and that is currently going through the channels of Cave Pictures. And the topic is obviously the Harrowing of Hell, which I think is totally fascinating. I think it'll be really great for listeners about it, because I suspect most of our listeners come from some sort of broadly evangelical Christian background, where the Harrowing of Hell isn't necessarily something that we talk about. So me personally, I grew up in a very evangelical, very loving, very evangelical home where this wasn't even a thing. Like, we didn't really think too hard about what happened between Good Friday and Easter. But now I'm in the Anglican Church, where it is more of a part that we discuss more often. So Jane, let's get your priors here. So you're obviously Catholic. What was your background with this? Does it vary from sort of the more evangelically listeners?
Yeah, so I grew up evangelical and was not familiar with the Harrowing of Hell. My husband is a cradle Catholic, and because I was reading him portions of this poem as I was reading through it, and he definitely grew up with a more awareness of this. The first encounter I had with the concept of the Harrowing of Hell was that Hieronymus Bosch painting, the very famous Harrowing of Hell painting. I remember seeing it in college and saying, what is going on here? But I remember growing up, some people in my community actually chose to leave out the line, he descended into hell, when they said the creed, because there was so little understanding what that meant and people were uncomfortable with it. So yeah, this was an imaginative stretch for me, Jonathan. I really enjoyed. I just hadn't, I don't know, even from looking at paintings and stuff, I hadn't really paused in this moment the way that I should have. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I kind of had a similar journey in many ways to both of you. I grew up in various Protestant denominations and pretty early on moved into kind of the more non-denominational charismatic churches. And so the Harrowing of Hell was never anything I ever heard of growing up, really. And so where I first, stumbled upon it was a journey reading Christian history. My family and I went to Rome, Italy years ago, and probably maybe 15 years ago, something like that. And it just kind of set my heart on fire to begin reading Christian history. So I went on what ended up being a 4-year journey, and it was really through reading as much as I could that I stumbled across this, that it kept being mentioned. And I thought, well, what is going on here? What is this? Because this appears to be quite significant, and yet it's not anything I've ever heard of. And then, it was like, wow, this is in like some of the ancient creeds. This is a pretty serious thing. And then you started to see it's actually in the scriptures. This is, and slowly started unfolding. And then, in my journey as the research in Christian history for me led my family and I into the Orthodox Church, into, what is known as Eastern Christianity. And there was a particular, for me, I would say, beauty in the way that the Eastern Church, the vision around Christ's descent into Hades, around the Harrowing of Hell, it was a very profound victory, a triumphant victory over death. And because I had never run across this articulated really in many forms at all, I was, crazy enough to just it was a deep desire to just want to express something of that beauty.
That is totally resonating with a lot of the stuff I've been going through and just in my continual reading and study as well. So maybe we should take, before we dive into the poem itself, let's take maybe a half step back and talk about what we mean by the Harrowing of Hell. But again, for listeners who may come from a tradition where that's not as emphasized, when we're talking about the Harrowing of Hell, what are we talking about?
Well, it's also known as Christ's descent into Hades. And, in the Apostles' Creed, it talks about, and as you mentioned, Jane, it talks about, and he descended into hell. which, was a very foundational Christian teaching from the very beginning. St. Peter talks about it in the scriptures, and it's referred to quite a few times, a bit enigmatically for sure, but it is there. And this would be on Holy Saturday after the crucifixion on Friday when Christ is laid in the tomb. It was taught and believed that his soul descended into Hades to preach the gospel to the prisoners held captive there and to release the captives. And in the Gospel of Matthew, I believe it is, there's even accounts of people rising from the dead when Christ himself rose. So there was this bursting forth that was even seen through some people rising from the dead, which is quite an astounding thing. So that's sort of, I think, the basic part of the story. And, it's fascinating to me because, one of the things in, the holy tradition in the Eastern Church is the salvation of Christ is emphasized holistically. His incarnation is emphasized just as much as his crucifixion, and his descent into hell is emphasized as being just as important of an event as his crucifixion and resurrection and incarnation. And all of these events are seen as one complete act of love and humility and self-emptying of Christ, of the second person of the Trinity. So, it's a part of this incredible, mysterious salvation story that just for various reasons hasn't really been highlighted. And I think in our day and age, I think it does have something to say to us about the love of God and the lengths to which he will go to meet us in our darkness and to be the light in the darkest places.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is 100% a theme that comes through in your poem, and which I really appreciated. And just sort of my little 2 cents to add on to that, something that helped clarify things for me was I think a lot of times in a lot of traditions, there's sort of this flip understanding that, there's heaven, which is the good place, and hell, which is the bad place, and that's sort of it. But especially when we're looking in the understanding of the scriptures in the Old Testament, that's not really the conception they have. There's Hades, there's the realm of the dead, and that's sort of a place where the righteous and the unrighteous go, and there's a lot of unpacking there about where like the good places are within there, the bad places are within there. But when we're talking about descending into hell, we're not like saying the bad place, we're saying the realm of the dead. Correct me if I'm getting anything wrong there, but that helped clarify things for me.
Yeah, I mean, there are, it's interesting because there are differences in the development. For instance, the Orthodox Church doesn't really have a doctrine of purgatory like the Roman Catholic Church does. And Hades is actually distinguished, like you're saying, from hell in the Orthodox teaching, kind of in an official sense. But over the years, the English translation of Hades and hell has kind of melded into, one thing. So for the sake of the poem, I just left that alone because I thought, in the Orthodox liturgical hymns and services, they mention hell and Hades as being interchangeable. Technically speaking, I think hell is understood more as the final place that after the judgment, after the resurrection and the judgment, that people, will go to hell. But for the sake of Christ descending into the lower regions to release the captives from the power of death, it all kind of, at least from an artistic, poetic sense, really has the same meaning for me.
Yeah, now let's talk about the artistic, poetic sense that you gave it in your poem. Let's start with like the overall structure. Jane, I'll turn this over to you because, again, I yield to your poetry knowledge, especially epic poems. Tell me about what you felt about the overall structure of the poem, and maybe turn it over to your first questions for Jonathan.
Sure. The first thing that struck me is the language that you choose and the way that you set this up in kind of it's got the series of climactic events, which is very traditional to epic poetry. And it kind of builds their multiple peaks and valleys in the plot flow. And then there's also this wonderful way that you give so many different titles for Christ throughout. I've got it pulled up on my screen, and there are a couple, even just on the one page that I'm looking at, where the truth of God, the hallowed King of Thunder. And I just think that was so, I don't know. I love the way that you came up with all these different titles for Christ. So a couple of questions there. First of all, the titles and some of your language really struck me as coming from an Anglo-Saxon background. It felt very English. It felt Beowulfy. It felt maybe like The Dream of the Rood. Was that a correct reading? Were you looking at those kinds of poems to construct this?
Well, specifically, a point of inspiration absolutely was Beowulf.
Okay.
Yeah, and so you were completely correct in feeling that inspiration. It's so. Other than reading Christian history, I forgot to mention where the first inspiration as well for doing this was my oldest son, when he was 6 or 7 years old, became very fascinated with the story of Beowulf, and because he was so young, we got him an audiobook of Seamus Heaney's translation of Beowulf, and so he would listen to this all the time. And as a father, I was just really struck by how captivated he was by the story of this hero who, went up against I think it was Grendel. And when I saw that, and there was something in me that my heart was moved to say, his heart is being drawn to Christ, who is the ultimate hero. And so I wanted to, first and foremost, write something that my children could connect with on a similar level of inspiration, but ultimately have them be captivated by the figure of Christ, who, is the hero of heroes. So, and I loved some of the terms that are used in primarily Seamus Heaney's translation, the Whale Road and things like this. It was very inspiring.
That's lovely. Yeah, I'm a little bit of an Anglo-Saxon geek, and I have a copy of the Gospel of John in West Saxon. In reading through it, it has this description during the crucifixion scene that translates to Christ as the young hero.
Wow.
And I think that's also possibly in The Dream of the Rood. They use sort of the same phrase. And that struck me, that the way that you're writing about Christ is more of that, I don't know, just that hero culture vision of Christ. And it's not one that I think a lot of people are familiar with. And to me, this just was a whole different imaginative vision of Christ as a young, triumphant hero in the midst of his battle. I think that's a really powerful vision. So, I think you've accomplished what you set out to do.
Well, thank God. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things that I think we've all probably experienced in the, modern, well, I guess our day and age, is it's easy for expressions of Christianity to forget the immensity of the figure of Christ. And sometimes society likes to highlight the moral teachings of Christ, which obviously are incredibly important and profound, and there's no end to the beauty and depth that's there. But sometimes there's an emphasis on the meek, mild teacher, and we forget that he is the vanquisher of death, that he is the one who was willing and capable of going up against our greatest foe and destroying the dragon. So this descent into Hades, into hell, it's an opportunity to just kind of unleash that a little bit inside of our hearts, to say, this same Christ who was so meek and was so gentle and children flocked to him, this is the same one who descended into hell and was willing to go to the uttermost, to fill all things with himself, so that we could return to him in the fullness of, the image and likeness of God. So, and the other thing I was just going to throw out there real quick was, it's interesting that you mentioned the titles given to Christ in the poem, because I had worked on a book of mystical poems called Book of Solace and Madness that came out in 2012. And the specific purpose of that poetry book was to try to express some of the inner life of how the soul relates to God without using language that people in the world would be familiar with in terms of religious language. So I had spent so many months limiting myself that when I turned to write the Harrowing of Hell, it was almost like this river kind of burst out. I was so excited to be able to just try to figure out all these different ways to say, how beautiful and how incredible Christ is. So I think there was something in, limiting myself in the prior book that kind of unleashed a little bit in this one.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you had drawn some of these names from tradition or if you had come up with them yourselves. I'm sure there's a blend. It just made me think of the Dionysius the Areopagite on the divine names. Right. It made me want to go back and check in on that. So did you draw from tradition for these? Are they translated from other languages, or are they just coming out of your soul?
Yeah, to be honest, it was a bit more of a streams of consciousness feeling around it. There wasn't, it's very, very possible that, because, during this time I was reading so many different books on history and the church fathers and things, and I'm sure there were terms and phrases and ways that they would speak about Christ that were inside of me that would come out. But it really wasn't an intellectual thing. I never, sat down and wrote notes like, I'll use this title and this title. It was more something that just came out in the process of writing the particular moment, and kind of, I think, just a culmination of reading a lot of different things over the years. I don't feel like any of it is necessarily original. It's just, it wasn't planned out. It kind of came out just in the inspiration of writing.
Yeah, so along some of the lines we've been talking about, I really appreciate what you and Jane were talking about, the connections with Anglo-Saxon poetry and the hero character. I recall, reading about early attempts by Christian missionaries to evangelize the, barbarian northerners with the gospel, and they often attempted to portray Jesus as the culmination of their heroic sagas. Like the true Balder or, something along those lines. And that got me thinking about one of the quotations you had sort of to begin your poem. And I will say when I read this, I was like, okay, good. He gets it. Me and him are going to be on the same page with this. And it was the C.S. Lewis quotation talking about how Christianity is a myth that is also a fact. And I was just wondering, how does that help you when you're writing a poem or just like living your Christian life, viewing Christianity as a myth? But like a true myth, like how does it help to have it in that mythic realm?
Yeah. It's such a great question, and there's so much there. I think for me, that first started to unfold again as I was studying Christian history, and I guess in church circles, obviously, we're very familiar with Christ as the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And Christ, He is the Messiah. He is the fulfillment of the yearning and the longing of Israel. But what isn't talked about as much is that Christ is also the yearning and the fulfillment of all peoples, of all cultures, of all times. And this is a very powerful thing that many of the early church fathers talked about. And not just the pagan myths, as Christ is a fulfillment of many of these, but He's also a fulfillment of the yearning and desire of the philosophers, which is incredible that, St. John, who, in the beginning of his gospel says, in the beginning was the Logos, which was drawing back to some of the philosophers. And it's an incredible revelation that the history of the Jewish people, we not only get to experience Christ as that fulfillment, but also when we look at the dying and resurrecting God in many of these pagan myths, we don't have to look at that as a negative thing. We can look at that and say, if we are made in the image of God, then Christ is echoing inside every single human being.
Yes.
His voice, His image, His sense, His presence is echoing inside of us. He's echoing from the past, and He's echoing from the future. So Beowulf is an echo also, even though it was written many years after Christ. It's an echo in the opposite direction. So for me, this was such a just deeply, deeply powerful thing. When I first started, it was maybe 19 or 20 when I was first reading about these things. It may have been St. Justin Martyr, or St. Clement of Alexandria. I mean, there are many of the church fathers who would talk about this as Christ he is the new song. He is the fulfillment. And so the sense of him being the fulfillment of myth, I relate to that as myth in history was the yearning of humanity so desperately looking for the one. And the fact that this myth actually came down into history, this yearning, this longing, this echo of a song actually came into history. And he was seen and touched and heard. And he fulfilled all of these incredible events that the human imagination and, faulty, unfulfilled religious yearning and philosophical yearning that existed, he is the culmination and the fulfillment of that. So I think it's a very rich, vision of Christianity, which has been there from the very beginning.
Yeah, you have this beautiful section in chapter 6 or section 6. I'm not sure if you think of them as chapters. Yeah. Okay, chapter 6, where Christ is in the very heart of hell, and he delivers this stunning speech in which he identifies himself as the master carpenter of the Asiatic prophets and the true Balder and the Ahura Mazda and all these different mythological types of redemptive figures that had come before him. And he says, I am all of them. Everything that's true in them, I'm making true in history. This section was just stunning. And a couple of notes just on your craft here. I loved how you incorporated the I ams of pulling from the biblical language and incorporating it into this speech. And then this whole section was beautiful. And I loved how this line where it says, it was almost as if the sweltering hall of Hades had been transformed into heaven itself by his mere presence. And I thought that was so poetic, because what you're doing by putting Christ in the center of all these myths is you're almost transforming all these myths into truth. Just as Christ being in hell brings heaven to the very heart of hell. It's just it's this entering in and exploding things and pulling out the light that's in them. It was just beautiful. So beautiful work on that section.
Thank you so much. Well, that was something for me that was such a deep, moving revelation. Again, I remember somebody gave me a CD years ago. It might have been our priest in Los Angeles. He gave me a CD, I think it was from Father Thomas Hopko. And it was a homily, a sermon on Christ's descent into Hades. I wasn't really prepared for what I was listening to at the time, because I was on my way to an appointment. It was about an hour drive. And I just spent the whole time in tears, because this revelation of Christ as the lover of mankind, filling all things with himself, was so powerful. And it was this sense of even the flames of hell are God's love. And what that means is, there is a version that has been spoken about a lot over the years, especially, I would say, in Europe and in the West, let's say. Hell is the place where God kind of punishes people, and there's almost a wrathful quality to this dynamic. And in the East, there's been a different emphasis on the dynamic of heaven and hell, where even the flames of hell are God's love. The same sun that melts wax hardens clay. So God is always love towards us, always. And if we reject love, then the flame of his love will feel like it's burning. But it's not wrath or anything punitive or petty. It's holy and pure and selfless and good. And that same love will melt some hearts, and we will be warmed and illuminated by it. And others, because of the great respect that God has for our freedom, others, we have the potential to be hardened and to gnash our teeth and to be resentful towards this goodness and towards this love. So, there's the psalm that says, where can I go? from your presence. Even if I make my bed in Sheol, in Hades, in the place of the dead, behold, you are there. God is with us. And so I had never really experienced that, growing up. I mean, it wasn't really talked about too much, I guess, but even to know that there is this ancient vision of hell that still maintains the love of God and the respect of our freedom. And it's not a cheap version of saying that there aren't any consequences for choices. It's saying, no, there are consequences, but it's not God vindictively punishing people for not measuring up. It's Him lovingly, with tears in His eyes, respecting our freedom. That's really where a lot of that stemmed from, and I hadn't experienced that until, I was kind of researching some of those things over the years.
Yeah, you have that heartbreaking line where Christ says, "I'm helpless before your freedom." Oh my goodness. Yes. I'd never heard it phrased that way before. And the love that God chooses to remain in that posture of waiting for us, for our freedom.
Yes.
Like, obviously, He doesn't have to.
Yeah.
But He chooses to be helpless before our freedom.
Yes.
That's some good stuff there.
All right. So I was just going to add to what Jane was saying. And early on, it becomes very clear when Jesus confronts the devil and, all the host of hell in the beginning, it's clear that if Jesus wanted to, He could just destroy everything and drag all the humans to heaven, whether they wanted to or not. That's very clearly within his power, but He doesn't, as Jane said, because He respects our freedom. So a lot of the tension throughout the remainder of the poem is human freedom. Will the humans in Hades that Jesus is taking along, choose to follow Him, to trust Him, or will they choose to turn in on themselves? That really came across very powerfully in all the different characters. So what was your thought process for the specific characters that you chose to be given that choice in the way that they made those choices?
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting thing to approach, and I think the instinct was I wanted there to be a balance between characters that people would be familiar with in the Old Testament, and also characters and real life people, obviously, that were from non-Jewish backgrounds and pagan backgrounds and everything, because again, this is the realm where Christ is the lover of all mankind. So, there's characters like Christ visits Absalom, and this was, and again, we're dealing with mystical things here, so it's a poetic guess at something that, could have occurred, and that's all that is, because we don't really understand or know the mystical events that took place. But as an example, Absalom it's a very profound and tragic story in the scriptures, a son betraying his father. And so there was a lot to work with there in terms of imagining Absalom as someone who betrayed his father David, and yet, he grew up with the truth. He grew up hearing his father's psalms. He grew up with the experiential knowledge of the beauty of God. And so what would that dynamic look like, where his life ended in an act of betrayal against his father, and so dramatically, his hair being stuck in the tree as he's fleeing, and then his father weeping over his son, even though his son had betrayed him. It was just devastating for David. So that's a character and a story that we're familiar with, but I also wanted to have characters like Lao Tzu, who was, an ancient Chinese sage, who was, in some ways, I would say, a prophet, a pagan prophet, in the sense that he was really searching for what he called the way. And we know that Christ came and said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." There's a beautiful, profound book by a monk called Christ, the Eternal Dao. And this monk took the ancient poems of Lao Tzu and kind of, in some sense, baptized them. He brought them into Christ and was still very reverential towards the original poems and their intent, but just fulfilled them gently and beautifully and organically in Christ. And I was so moved when I read this years ago that the figure of Lao Tzu always was deep in my heart. And so that came out naturally in the poem. So, and then there are other figures that are kind of glanced at. I didn't really go heavy-handed, but there's, Alexander the Great, even though he's not really named with that title, but he's there as a Greek warrior. So, I wanted there to be a balance between, pagan and Greek, and also Hebrew characters to just, have Christ as the universal Savior.
The Lao Tzu section is one of my favorites. It was just, that meeting felt different. There was this tenderness and this, it was almost a different quality of joy, because Lao Tzu had come so close but hadn't had any of the names or any of the structures of the Jewish faith. Mm-hmm. So the revelation for him felt different, and I don't know, that was just such a beautiful section, and how Christ calls him my friend. Yeah, that was lovely.
I totally agree with what Jane said, and I found the Lao Tzu passage really moving. So you have the characters, some like Lao Tzu sort of embrace Jesus enthusiastically. Yeah, like, this is the desire of my longing, the thing I couldn't name, but that's what I was searching for. You have others like Absalom, who wrestle with the choice, and there's literally the devil whispering in his ear, encouraging him to reject Jesus, but he makes the choice to follow. But you have other characters who are presented with the choice to follow Jesus. And I think, as you put this in the poem, they turn in on themselves again. And how did you go about doing that? And what was the motivation behind those scenes?
The motivation was, again, to sort of dramatize the dilemma of human choice and human freedom. So there are elements of fear, elements of shame and guilt, elements of the demonic voices and monologues that occur, as opposed to the voice of Christ, who is the truth. And, he's offering various souls their true identity. And yet there is a wrestling that takes place oftentimes. So that was really the motivation. And I wanted there to be, within the economy of the story, which it's not a very long book, but I wanted there to be examples of, like you said, just a complete fulfillment of the longing, examples of a sort of tormented dilemma that eventually people choose bravely to follow Christ. And then also elements of ones that, for whatever reason, continue to, with envy and malice and bitterness and anger towards love and towards the light, reject Christ. And obviously, there's a beautiful scripture where, it talks about that the Father is not willing that any should perish. So the heart of God is that everyone receives his love. But we don't really know at the end of the day, how many will choose. So it was really just emphasizing that, the dynamic of freedom. And again, as we were talking about before, what that does as well is it magnifies the restraint, the sort of, for me, almost unfathomable restraint that God has in his love for us. And that dynamic is just continues to be really stunning for me in my own life. And so it was looking for those moments in the poem to highlight those various dynamics. I mean, and in some ways we go through those various dynamics at different stages of our life, oftentimes.
Jonathan, in the poem, something that really stood out to me was how you make artistically and elegantly, but still make at least two strong doctrinal assertions. And the ones that stood out to me are, you assert that Christ is a historical figure. And you assert that, as far as we know, hell is not empty. Those are both contentious, difficult claims, but you do them within the poem. You do them very organically and beautifully. They're part of the essence of the poem. And I just wondered if, for the practicing artists in the Anselm group and who will listen to this podcast, can you talk a little bit about what you see the relationship between doctrinal and theological truths like that and art, where sometimes you get into these mysteries and you have to live in both worlds at the same time. Can you just talk a little about that process for you, both creatively as you're making and also in your spirit as you're trying to do these difficult things?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. First of all, I would just say that my prayer and intent in writing it is to be as faithful to holy tradition as I can be within a work of poetry, a work of envisioning these events. So there are other books of prose and theology that can clarify some of these gray areas that are no doubt come into play working in a realm like this. But the intent is absolutely to be as accurate as possible, and to only, for myself, only assert things that have been taught from the beginning. There's the beautiful scripture, the faith delivered to the once for all to the saints. That's really the goal. So it is very important to say that, yes, Christ is a historical figure. Absolutely. That is the entire message of the apostles. As we mentioned before, as St. John said, we have seen and touched and heard, and we give testimony to this. So the historical Christ that is hopefully the best to my, fallible ability, the hope is that it's in line with the holy tradition. And in terms of, I guess, hell not being emptied, that's more of a difficult one, I think, in the sense that the way I would say it is that my understanding, at least at this stage of things, in terms of the way that the Orthodox Church would talk about this, would be that Christ, he emptied hell in the sense of there is no barrier there anymore. The door is open to paradise. So if there are any remaining, it's only because people have chosen to remain there.
Yeah.
So that was really the emphasis of, in the poem was, see, if I would have depicted everyone choosing to follow Christ, then it would have caused a whole nother problem, which is some people, modern and throughout history, have asserted that, everyone will be saved at the end. And this is not really an official teaching of the Orthodox Church, although there are individual saints within the Church that have believed some version of this. It's not a teaching of the Church. So I wasn't comfortable making that assertion. I actually found it much more profound to say, again, to emphasize human freedom. And to say, we don't know how many people, if everyone, if 98% of the people, the souls chose, or in the end will choose, to follow the light. We don't know, but what we do know is that there is freedom and that people do have the ability to reject God. Because if we don't have that freedom, then our relationship with God is more like a puppeteer or robots and mechanical. And so I think it was very important to emphasize that it is possible to reject love and to be face to face with love itself and to say, I don't want you. I would rather remain enclosed in myself. And your very presence of love is a burning to me. I don't really appreciate your eyes of love upon me right now. And the description of hell, and there's so much metaphor going on here too, because then you get into the, many of the church fathers would say that it's not a geographical place that's being described, it's the state of the soul that is being described. So a lot of mysteries here, and that's one of the main reasons why I thought this has to be in the realm of poetry, because it's not a perfect theological explanation of anything. It's an artistic, poetic vision of this mystery, which, God willing, in His grace, reflects something that is in harmony as a work of art with the holy tradition. And in particular, from my own experience, the holy tradition that comes from the Orthodox faith.
So I was just going to say to that, Jonathan, I think the way that you did that throughout the poem was very powerful. And I'm especially thinking about the scene where Jesus is speaking with Jezebel. Jezebel, who's in the running for the very worst character in the Old Testament.
Right.
Even then, Jesus responds to her in love, saying, "Hey, it's not too late. Abandon all this and follow me." It's presented there. But like you said earlier, the same sun that melts wax will harden clay. And the love of Christ, instead of melting her heart like it did for someone like Absalom, it hardens her heart. And by her choice, the love becomes something that she wants to flee. And I thought you just did that in a really powerful way. And that was just what I thought was one of the most thought-provoking and moving parts of the poem there. Yeah, so Jane, have you narrowed down your slew of questions to one?
I'm trying to decide between talking about the section with the Virgin and talking about the gorgeous section with Eve. And they're almost the same section, but I don't think I can get away with talking about both of them. So I will just say, Jonathan, I'd love if you could just briefly talk about, because obviously there are these parallels between the Virgin and Eve is such a tragic character who just gets so much. I mean, it's a terrible fate. And what was it like getting to write that section and just spend some time like sitting with, in a way, this person who is our mother, but who has been removed from that role? That's such a difficult heart space. So did you have any sources that you looked at for this, or how did you do that section? Because it's so powerful and so hard.
Well, again, all of the inspiration and everything I was drawing from was really just the accumulation of many years of reading the church fathers and church history and all of these kinds of things. So, and the scriptures themselves, obviously. But it's interesting that you mention that in the context of the Mother of God, because, growing up Protestant, the Virgin Mary is certainly not someone that is talked about very much at all. But I fell in love with, the sort of highbrow word would be typology. But I didn't know that at the time. I was listening to when I was a kid, I was probably 12, 13 years old, I was listening to this Australian evangelical pastor who was quite read with the church fathers. And he taught a lot of, foreshadowings in the Old Testament and how that is fulfilled in the New Testament. And so at a young age, I was really drawn to this, again, what I would call the poetry of God, when Abraham is going to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Isaac is the promised child, carrying the wood on his shoulder, marching up the mountain to be the sacrifice. That is a foreshadowing of Christ, the Son of God, the Son of the Father, carrying the cross on his shoulders, walking to Golgotha. And, I mean, the scriptures are just so full of these mind-blowing revelations. And one of these beautiful revelations that wasn't talked about growing up much was the Virgin Mary as the second Eve.
Yeah.
And so, journeying towards the Orthodox faith, that was something that I had to contend with for sure, which really wasn't easy in the very beginning. But in the poem, I guess I'll be specific. I'll tell you where a lot of that came from was in the service on Holy Saturday in the Orthodox Lenten Triodion. You walk through Holy Week, and there are these incredible hymns and poems that express so much of this. And some of the sections that are italicized are quoted from that. And there's a dialogue that the Virgin Mary has with Christ when he's in Hades. And so that dialogue that is italicized, where Christ says, "Mourn not for me, Mother." And then she responds to him. It's just so powerful and incredible. So all of that was kind of colliding, the depictions of the Virgin Mary and also the depictions of Christ, with Eve, and Christ as the second Adam as well. So there's so much there. But again, I think that Adam and Eve feature in these icons. For instance, the ancient depictions of these events there's something so hopeful in that.
Oh, yeah.
That the tragedy of, sin coming into the world has this incredible hope that God is not willing that any should perish.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say for our church, an Easter or two ago, our priest his Easter sermon was, built around that icon that you're talking about of Jesus breaking down the gates of Hades and pulling up Adam and Eve out of death. And it's such a tremendously moving icon. And Jane, I'm so glad you brought up Eve and the Virgin Mary, because as soon as you mentioned, it's like, oh yeah, we didn't even talk about that. And that was such a good section. So it just shows there's a lot of stuff here in this poem to enjoy, and a lot to think about and mull over. It's a very powerful thing. So Jonathan, thank you so much for being on the podcast. So we're out of time, but could you let us know, where can we find you and your other work? Where can we find the Harrowing of Hell poem? Point us in the right direction for all that.
Yeah, well, thank you both for taking the time to read the poem and have this discussion. I'm just very grateful. So currently, right now, we're doing an Indiegogo campaign around the book to raise funds for illustrations and the first hardback printing. So that's live. I guess if this interview airs a week from now, it'll still be live for another couple weeks. And, just jonathanjackson.com as well. We'll have other information and things. But currently, the Indiegogo campaign is certainly what we're, focusing on at the moment.
All right, great. Well, thank you again. Really appreciated you joining us here. And, well, listeners, things are winding down at the Anselm Digital Pub. Fire's down to embers, customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.